Section 1. The Night That Breathes. There is something that lives in the dark, not the comforting dark of a bedroom with the lights off, not the peaceful dark behind your eyelids when you finally rest. Something else. Something that watches, that waits, that has been crouching in the shadows of the Warhammer 40,000 universe for 10,000 years, patient in the way only the truly terrifying can be patient. Something that has not spoken in millennia, but has never truly gone quiet. His name is Konrad Curze. And everything you think you know about him being dead might be wrong. Let that settle for a moment. Breathe it in. The Night Haunter, the 8th Primarch, the walking nightmare in power armor, who stood over a galaxy and said, very calmly, that he had been right all along. The figure who looked at the entire project of the Emperor of Mankind, with all its golden rhetoric about civilization and light and human destiny, and saw through it to the mechanism underneath, the iron fist wrapped in a silk glove, the assassin lurking behind the throne. Curze died, or something like death happened to him, on a world called Sigwalsa at the edge of known space. A Calidus assassin named Mishen slipped through his unguarded palace in the darkness and found him waiting on his throne, and the lights went out on one of the most philosophically complex figures this setting has ever produced. His last recorded words, transmitted across the void like a dying signal bouncing between stars, were addressed to the Emperor himself. He said, "Your servants have come to kill me. Death is nothing compared to vindication." And then the recording cut out. That ambiguity, that deliberately unresolved moment where the feed goes dark before anyone can confirm what actually happened, has sat in the lore like a splinter under the skin for decades. Games Workshop left the door ajar. They left it open just wide enough for the wind to move through, for the shadows to shift, for the possibility that the most dangerous Primarch of them all was never truly gone at all. Today, we are going to walk into that darkness together, slowly, and look at what is waiting there. We are going to cover everything. We will start at the beginning, at the broken planet of Nostromo, where a child without a name clawed his way out of the underworld and became something beyond human fear. We will move through the Great Crusade and watch a genius commander slowly unravel under the weight of what he could see and no one else would believe. We will follow him through the Horus Heresy, through battles that make most military campaigns look like minor disagreements, through the shattering of the Imperium he was meant to serve. We will sit with him in that final throne room on Sigwalsa and ask the question the lore never quite answered. And then we will talk about the present, the raw, shattered, bleeding present of the 42nd millennium, where the galaxy has been torn in half by something called the Great Rift, where chaos bleeds openly into real space, where the Imperium is more desperate than it has been since the days of Horus himself. We will look at what the Night Lords are doing right now, scattered and savage and leaderless, and we will ask whether that state of affairs is really meant to last. Because if Konrad Curze comes back, and there are more reasons to believe that is possible than most people discuss, then it does not just affect the Night Lords. It does not just shift some pieces on the board. It changes everything. It changes the nature of chaos itself. It changes what the Indomitus Crusade is fighting against. It changes the philosophical heart of this setting, which has always been most alive when it is asking the hardest questions about power and justice, and what we are willing to do in the name of order. So, let us begin in the only place this story can really begin. In the dark, on a world that was never meant to exist, on a night that never ended. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you want to keep walking into the dark with us, that subscribe button is right there. It costs nothing. We have many nights ahead. There is a particular quality to waiting that only the Night Haunter's story captures properly. Not the waiting of someone who does not know when the waiting will end, the uncertain, suspended animation of a person in a difficult circumstance who cannot see out the other side. The waiting of a being who knows exactly how long the waiting will take, who can see the moment of its end with the same clarity that they can see the present, who has chosen to wait because the waiting is part of the plan, and the plan is the only thing that has ever mattered. The Night Haunter was the only Primarch who could look at his own death and see past it. The only one whose gift extended in both directions simultaneously, backward through the record of what had already happened, and forward through the fog of what had not yet occurred, with equal clarity in both directions and no preference between them. He did not fear the future because the future was as legible to him as history. He did not mourn the past because the past was simply what the future had already done to him, and he had seen it coming. This is what made him unlike every other figure in the Horus Heresy, and every figure who came after. He was the only one operating with complete information and choosing, on the basis of that complete information, to do what he did. Every other Primarch, loyal or traitor, was making decisions in the context of uncertainty, of knowledge that was incomplete, of futures that might go one way or another, depending on choices not yet made. Curze was not. Curze knew, and he chose what he chose, in full knowledge of what it meant. That level of moral weight is something the setting does not usually confront so directly, and it is part of why Curze remains the most philosophically interesting figure in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. We cannot excuse him on the grounds of ignorance or manipulation, or the terrible contingency of being in the wrong place at the wrong time and making decisions that any reasonable person might have made under the same pressures. He knew what he was doing. He had seen what it would become. He did it anyway. And now he may be coming back. Section 2. Nostromo, the world that built a monster. To understand Konrad Curze, you have to understand Nostromo. And to understand Nostromo, you have to stop thinking about it as a simple setting detail and start thinking about it as a formative wound that never healed. Nostromo was a hive world. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, hive worlds are already grim places. Vast urban sprawls built up over centuries until the cities themselves become the landscape, kilometers of concrete and metal, stacked on concrete, billions of souls packed into structures that were never designed for them. Most hive worlds have their miseries and their hardships and their squalor, but they also have governance of some kind, supply lines, hierarchy, something approaching order, even if that order is brutal and unfair in the way that all order tends to be in a universe where human beings have been grinding each other down for 30,000 years. Nostromo had none of that. The planet sat under a polluted sky so thick with industrial smog that its dying star could barely push any light through it. The surface of Nostromo existed in a state of near-permanent night, a deep and suffocating darkness that was as much the product of civilization's waste as it was of astronomy. Underneath that murk, billions of people lived and died in conditions that would be unimaginable to even the most desperate Imperial citizens elsewhere. The mining industry, which formed the backbone of Nostromo's economy, was controlled by a small, elite class of patricians who extracted enormous wealth from the planet's rich adamantium deposits, and they did so on the backs of a population kept deliberately poor, deliberately ignorant, and deliberately afraid. Crime was not a problem on Nostromo. Crime was the organizing principle. The rich hired criminals to keep the poor in line. The criminals fought each other for territory and resources. The poor survived in whatever cracks they could find between one form of predation and another. Murder was so common it barely registered as an event. Suicide, according to the records that survived the planet's eventual destruction, was one of the primary population controls. When life is so without hope that ending it early seems preferable to continuing, you have built something that is less a civilization than a sustained atrocity. Into this came the infant Primarch, Konrad Curze. He did not arrive the way most Primarchs arrived. The story of the Primarchs is partly a story of found children, of demigods washing up in new worlds and being adopted into families, raised by parents who did not know what they had found, but loved or feared or treasured them anyway. Curze had none of that. His gestation capsule, ripped from the Emperor's creation process by the machinations of the Chaos Gods and hurled through the warp, punched through Nostromo's crust and drove itself deep into the planet's geosphere before the infant inside somehow survived and emerged. No family took him in, no community claimed him. He crawled up out of the pit he had made and found himself in the darkest city on a dark world, alone, with no name, no history, and nothing but the sound of the city around him. The vision started almost immediately. This is the detail about Curze that tends to get glossed over in favor of the more visceral parts of his story, but it is absolutely central to understanding who he was and why he made the choices he made. From his earliest moments of consciousness, Konrad Curze saw the future. Not in the vague, impressionistic way of most psychics in this setting, not in riddles and half-formed images that require interpretation. He saw it with uncomfortable clarity. He saw specific deaths, specific atrocities, specific moments of suffering that had not yet occurred but were coming, as inevitable as weather, as unavoidable as gravity. He grew up seeing what was going to happen to the people around him before it happened. He understood, at an age when most children are still learning words, that the world was not random, that its horrors followed a logic, that the suffering of the weak was not accident but structure, built into the system, maintained by the people with power, preserved deliberately because it served them to preserve it. The child who would become the Night Haunter did not decide to become a vigilante because he read too many stories about heroes. He decided to become one because his visions showed him what was coming, and the only way he could find to interrupt those visions was to interrupt the events that caused them. He hunted criminals. He left their bodies displayed in public places, arranged as warnings. He invented a mythology around himself, the Night Haunter, the darkness that came for those who hurt others. And he fed that mythology deliberately, because he understood, even as a child, that fear was more efficient than force. Kill a man and you stop one crime. Make everyone afraid of what might happen to them if they commit that crime, and you stop 10,000. This was not a philosophy he arrived at through abstract reasoning. It was a practical conclusion drawn from years of observation of a system designed to break people. He had seen what gentleness accomplished on Nostromo. Nothing. The strong took what they wanted. The weak suffered. The only thing that moved the needle was terror. It worked. The crime rates in Nostromo Quintus dropped dramatically as the Night Haunter's legend grew. The population lived in fear, but they lived. The rich and powerful, the ones who had built the system that ground everyone else down, found themselves suddenly uncertain whether the thing in the dark might come for them too. By the time the Emperor found Curze, Nostromo had transformed, not into anything approaching good, not into a world of justice and kindness and genuine safety, but into something that resembled order. A terrified, tightly wound, constantly supervised order, maintained entirely by the threat of a single figure who no one had ever seen clearly, and everyone was certain would find them if they stepped out of line. This was the tool the Emperor found. This was what he picked up and said, yes, this will be useful. And that choice, that decision to absorb Curze and his methods into the Great Crusade, rather than sitting with the more difficult question of whether those methods were creating something genuinely healthy or just a different flavor of oppression, is the seed of everything that follows. The Emperor was, in his own way, doing exactly what Curze did, using fear and force to build an empire, clothing it in the language of civilization and human destiny, but underneath the rhetoric, maintaining it through violence. Curze, who could see clearly, saw this from the very beginning, and the fact that he could see it, and no one around him would admit it, is what began to drive him apart from his brothers and from the project they had all been built to serve. Nostromo itself would not survive the reunion with its monster. When Curze eventually learned that his homeworld had slid back into crime and corruption in his absence, that the recruits being sent to the Night Lords from Nostromo were the worst the planet had to offer rather than the best, he made a decision that is simultaneously comprehensible and horrifying. He directed his fleet to open fire on the one weak point in Nostromo's adamantium crust and destroyed the planet entirely. Billions of lives, an entire world's history, the origin point of his own existence, all of it turned to debris floating through the void. He said nothing about it afterward. There was nothing to say. He had seen what Nostromo was, had spent his entire early life trying to make it something else, and it had reverted the moment his attention was elsewhere. The lesson, as far as Curze was concerned, was simply confirmed. People do not change unless they are afraid. And when the source of fear is removed, they stop pretending. This is the foundation. This is what we are working with when we try to understand everything that comes after. What Curze built on Nostromo was not a reign of terror in the casual sense that phrase is usually used. It was something closer to a controlled social experiment, the most ambitious one any individual has ever conducted without institutional backing, asking a question that political philosophers have debated for centuries in different forms. Can sustained, targeted fear of consequences substitute for genuine moral development in a population that has no foundation for moral development left? He tested this thesis on billions of people over years, and he recorded the results in his memory and in his visions with the obsessive attention of a scientist who understands that his data is also his autobiography. The results were genuinely mixed in ways that the simple narrative of his descent into villainy does not capture. Crime dropped dramatically and measurably in the areas where the Night Haunter operated. The most predatory and most destructive elements of Nostromo's society were suppressed, sometimes by their deaths and sometimes by the realization that certain behaviors had become too dangerous to continue. People who would have been killed in the ordinary course of Nostromo life survived because the killers were afraid of what might find them in the dark. That is a real and measurable good that happened specifically because of what Curze did. Dismissing it entirely in the rush to condemn his methods misses something important about the genuine difficulty of the question he was trying to answer. But fear of a figure is not the same as the internalization of values, and this distinction is where Curze's entire worldview gets its particular shape. The people of Nostromo stopped committing certain crimes because they were afraid of what might happen to them if they continued, not because they had developed any genuine commitment to not committing those crimes. Curze knew this. His visions showed him exactly what would happen the moment the source of fear was removed, and they showed it to him accurately. The compliance was real, and the compliance was entirely conditional, and the compliance depended on his presence in the way that a locked door depends on the lock. Remove the lock, and the door swings open immediately. This is the philosophical fault line that runs underneath everything Curze ever did and every argument he ever made. He experienced human behavior as fundamentally governed by incentive structures rather than by internalized ethics. The things people do when they believe they are not watched tell you what they actually value. The things they do when they know consequences are coming tell you only what consequences they are trying to avoid. His life on Nostromo had given him a very specific and very extensive sample of what people do when they are not watched, and that sample had shaped his worldview in ways he held as certainty rather than as hypothesis. He was not wrong that this describes a real dynamic in human psychology. Fear does shape behavior. Consequences do produce compliance. These are genuinely true things that any honest analysis of human social organization has to acknowledge. Where the argument gets complicated is in the question of whether these dynamics describe the complete picture, whether fear governance is the only available mechanism, whether the particular darkness of Nostromo Quintus was actually representative of human nature across all possible conditions and cultures. His brother Vulcan would later demonstrate something that challenged this picture without quite refuting it. A being of extraordinary internal resilience who maintained his essential values through suffering that would have broken almost any other entity. But Curze filed Vulcan in the exception category rather than allowing him to complicate the model. This is a recognizable human cognitive move, the instinct to maintain a strongly held belief by reclassifying challenging evidence rather than updating the underlying framework. In Curze's case, the belief was held with the force of a lifetime of confirmation and the certainty of a man who can see the future and has never once been wrong about what he saw. He carried Nostromo with him everywhere. He carried it in the architecture of every argument he made, in the certainty behind every act of deliberate terror, in the patient and relentless way he arranged demonstrations of his thesis across the galaxy for decades. When he finally destroyed it, turning the world that had made him from a living place to expanding debris and frozen gas, he was attempting something that cannot quite be named simply as punishment. He was trying to put down the weight of it, to make the wound external enough that it could be closed rather than carried. It did not work. The wound was never in Nostromo. It was in the understanding Nostromo had built inside him, and that understanding does not disappear when you destroy its source. It simply continues confirming itself in everything subsequent. Section 3. The Great Crusade and the Emperor's Bluntest Instrument. The Great Crusade is generally presented in Warhammer 40,000's history as the Golden Age. The Emperor and his Primarchs, the 20 Sons and their 20 legions, driving outward from Terra into a galaxy that had been left to fragment and suffer in the long dark following Old Night. World after world reunited with humanity's growing domain. The Primarchs were the vanguard of this project, each one a different kind of answer to the question of what a superhuman being built for war could be. Robert Guilliman was the Administrator General, building supply chains and protocols behind the advance. Leman Russ was the executioner, deployed against those who would not be reasoned with. Sanguinius was the golden angel, the symbol of what humanity might aspire to become. And Konrad Curze was the threat behind the curtain, the thing the Emperor pointed at, worlds that needed to be reminded that submission was the only option. He was extraordinarily effective at this role. The Night Lords under Curze's command were not like other legions. They did not simply conquer. They arrived like a bad dream, dropping onto target worlds in the dark, hours before dawn, and they did not win by force alone. They won by making the idea of resistance so psychologically untenable that most populations simply stopped resisting. They would take one city, or one district, or one administrative center, and they would do such thorough and deliberate work on it that news of what had happened there would spread like a sickness through the rest of the world. By the time the Night Lords moved on to the next objective, they often did not need to fire a single shot. The populations had already imagined what was coming and had decided imagination was enough. Curze's relationship with his brothers during this period was never easy. Most of the other Primarchs found him deeply uncomfortable to be around, and not just because of his methods. There was something about the way he interacted with the world, the weight of the visions he was always carrying, the knowledge that he could see where conversations were going before they got there, that made sustained closeness difficult. He tried, in his way, to reach out. He confided in Fulgrim, the beautiful and brilliant Primarch of the Emperor's children, about the visions that plagued him. Fulgrim's response was to share what Curze had told him with Rogel Dorn, the stern and upright Primarch of the Imperial Fists, and Dorn's response was essentially to dismiss Curze as unstable and dangerous. That betrayal, small as it might seem in the context of everything that followed, was significant. Curze had reached for connection and found instead that his confidence had been passed on like gossip. He pulled back further into himself and further into the dark. The visions, which had always been disturbing, were becoming increasingly focused on catastrophe at a galactic scale. He saw the heresy coming, or something like it, years before it happened. He saw civil war and fraternal slaughter and the burning of a dream that had barely finished being built. He tried to warn people. He did so in the only language he knew how to use, which was not exactly a language of warm persuasion, and nobody listened. Meanwhile, the methods were becoming harder to defend, even within the framework of the Great Crusade. The Night Lords' approach to compliance worked, brutally and efficiently, but it left worlds in a state that could not really be called thriving. Populations cowed by terror are not populations building civilization. They are populations waiting for the next horror, doing the minimum required to avoid it, generating nothing in the way of genuine development or culture or forward momentum. The worlds Curze touched were compliant and broken, and would remain that way. His brothers noticed this. Magnus the Red, the scholarly Primarch of the Thousand Suns, was particularly vocal about it. The philosophical disagreement between Curze and the more humanistic of his brothers was not abstract. It was a debate about whether the end justified the means, and whether a civilization founded on fear could ever truly be called civilization. Curze's answer was consistent and, in its own terrible way, logical. He did not believe civilization was real. He did not believe that humanity, left to its own devices, would choose anything other than exploitation and cruelty. Every society he had ever seen, every world, confirmed this. The patricians of Nostromo, the warlords of the worlds the Great Crusade, came to liberate. The rich and powerful everywhere, doing what the rich and powerful always did. The only difference between a good society and an evil one, he argued, was the quality of the leash. Whether the people in control kept the worst impulses of the powerful in check, through genuine commitment to something larger than themselves, or through fear of consequences. And the Emperor's Imperium, as far as Konrad Curze could see, was absolutely using fear of consequences. It just dressed that mechanism in better clothes than the Night Haunter did. The tension between Curze and Rogel Dorn eventually exploded into something more literal. Curze, driven by the accumulated weight of being ignored and dismissed and having his methods condemned by brothers who were doing the same thing in cleaner ways, assaulted Dorn physically and left him badly wounded. He was imprisoned, facing a conclave of his brothers that was supposed to deliver some kind of verdict on his conduct. He escaped before it could happen. Escaped, rejoined his legion, went back to Nostromo and destroyed it. Whatever remained of the diplomatic relationship between the Night Haunter and the Emperor's project essentially ended there. The question of what to do about Curze became moot when Horus Lupercal began the heresy, because suddenly there were far larger problems. And Curze, who had been watching the Imperium build toward this for years, made his choice, not out of loyalty to Horus, not out of devotion to the Chaos Gods, which he never truly embraced the way his brothers in treachery did. He made his choice because the heresy in his mind was proof. It was the thing he had warned was coming and had been told he was wrong about. He joined the traitors because the traitors were the honest ones. They were doing openly what everyone else was doing quietly. He was wrong about that, in some important ways. He was also not entirely wrong, which is what makes him so enduring a figure. The specific character of the tension between Curze and his brother, Primarchs, during the Great Crusade, deserves more careful analysis than it usually receives, because that tension was not simply a personality conflict or a differences in methodology dispute. It was a fundamental disagreement about what the Great Crusade was actually doing, expressed through the lens of how it was being done. The Primarchs, who condemned Curze's methods most loudly, figures like Sanguinius of the Blood Angels or Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, were making an argument that the Great Crusade's violence needed to be bounded by certain principles and conducted in ways that left room for the populations it touched to develop into something genuinely better than what they had been before it arrived. They believed, with varying degrees of explicit theorizing about it, that the means mattered, that a civilization built through methods that destroyed the dignity of the people being built into it was not actually the civilization the Emperor claimed to be constructing. Curze's counter to this was always the same, and always carried the weight of his prescience behind it. "Show me the evidence," he was saying. "Show me the civilization that built itself through anything other than fear and force, that maintained itself through anything other than the threat of consequences, that produced compliance through anything other than the calculation that the cost of non-compliance was too high." He had looked, with visions that covered a vast sweep of human history across countless worlds, and he had not found it. He had found rhetoric and ideology, and the stories that societies told themselves about why their fear systems were different from other societies' fear systems. But he had not found the underlying mechanism being different. This argument was most pointed in its application to the Emperor himself. Curze did not believe the Emperor was hypocritical in a petty sense, did not believe he was consciously deceiving anyone when he claimed to stand for human civilization and human potential. He believed the Emperor had successfully deceived himself, had built a self-understanding that omitted the mechanism at the foundation. The golden rhetoric about humanity's destiny, and the light of reason, and the civilization that would eventually transcend war and darkness, was not a lie, exactly. It was a very carefully selected, incomplete truth that left out the part about how the selection process worked and what it cost to maintain it. Curze was the part that was left out. He was the mechanism made visible, the cost rendered explicit, the incomplete truth's completion, standing there in lightning claw armor, and explaining to anyone willing to listen that the beautiful building they were standing in had specific and identifiable people in its foundations. His brothers did not want to hear this. It is one of the consistent features of people who are doing something difficult and costly in service of a goal they believe in, that they do not want the person standing next to them explaining in detail that the goal and the methods more continuous than they would prefer. Curze did not give anyone the option to not hear it. He made it impossible to look away from by being, at all times, exactly the thing that would not be acknowledged. His assault on Rogel Dorn was the physical expression of this dynamic, reaching its breaking point. Dorn, the most rigid and most structurally committed of the Primarchs, the one for whom order and the maintenance of proper hierarchy was the fundamental organizing principle of his existence, represented everything that Curze found most dishonest about the Loyalist project. Dorn believed in the structure. He believed that the Emperor's rules and the Emperor's system were genuinely different from the disorder they replaced, and that maintaining the rules was the most important thing any of them could do. He had heard Curze's argument through Fulgrim's report of it, and had dismissed it as the rationalization of an unstable mind. The physical confrontation was not spontaneous. It was the logical conclusion of a philosophical dispute between two beings whose respective commitments could not coexist in the same framework. That Curze was then imprisoned and facing a conclave of judgment tells you something about how seriously the rest of the Primarchs took the philosophical threat he represented as opposed to the physical one. He was not dangerous primarily because he could win a fight with Rogel Dorn. He was dangerous because the argument he was making had evidence behind it and would not stop being true just because everyone found it uncomfortable. He escaped before the verdict came. Horus had already begun plotting, and the heresy absorbed the attention that would otherwise have been directed at resolving the Curze problem. The problem simply went unsolved, unresolved, carried forward into the Civil War as another wound in the body of the Primarch family that would never quite heal. Section 4. The Descent Darkness, Choosing Darkness. There is a pattern to how the Primarchs fell, and Curze's fall is both the most gradual and the most complete of any of them. The others who turned traitor tended to do so through a discrete crisis. Horus was wounded on Davin and found his faith in the Emperor insufficient to survive the experience. Magnus the Red accidentally broke the wards, protecting the Emperor's great work, and panicked into a choice that led inevitably to ruin. Even Fulgrim's corruption came through a specific object, a specific moment, a blade that carried a daemon waiting for the right moment of weakness. Curze did not fall so much as sink. He had been sinking since the first vision came, since he looked at a dying planet and saw it clearly and understood that clarity was not power, it was burden. Every year of the Great Crusade pushed him a little further from the idea that what he was doing had meaning beyond the moment. Every dismissal from his brothers embedded the certainty that he was alone with a truth no one wanted to hear. Every vision of what was coming was another weight added to a load that was becoming impossible to carry. The visions themselves deserve more attention than they usually get. In the Warhammer 40,000 setting, psychic ability is largely tied to the warp, that roiling dimension of pure emotion and psychic energy that exists beneath and beside reality, from which the Chaos Gods draw their power. Most psychers are, to some degree, vulnerable to warp corruption, because accessing psychic power means opening a channel to a place where demons live and hunger. The remarkable thing about Curze's precognition is that it operated outside this mechanism. The lore states explicitly that his ability was unique, not a product of warp interaction, not tied to the unpredictable interference that made most prophetic visions unreliable and difficult to interpret. This means the visions were accurate. This means Curze genuinely knew what was coming. He saw the heresy. He saw the deaths of billions. He saw the galaxy splitting and burning, and the project of civilization collapsing under its own contradictions. He saw it all with the kind of clarity that most beings in this universe are mercifully protected from, and he had to carry that knowledge while being surrounded by brothers and legions, and an emperor who were all moving confidently toward the catastrophe he could already see ahead of them. Imagine spending your entire life knowing how a story ends, and being unable to convince anyone that the ending is coming. Imagine the particular madness of that, the way it hollows out the capacity for hope, the way it makes investment in the present feel like a kind of stupidity. Why build anything if you can already see it burning? Why form relationships if you already know how they are going to hurt you? By the time the heresy began, Curze was a figure defined by nihilism, not the pose of nihilism that some philosophical traditions adopt as a kind of intellectual game, but the deep, lived nihilism of someone who has been shown that nothing stays, that effort is temporary, that the worst always tends to win in the end. He joined the traitor cause not with enthusiasm, but with a kind of exhausted recognition. Of course this was happening. He had known it would. His behavior during the heresy was consequently erratic in a way that frustrated even his allies. He terrorized imperial worlds with tactics that went beyond military necessity by any measure. He inflicted suffering that served no strategic purpose. He turned entire campaigns into elaborate demonstrations of his thesis that civilization was a fiction and that all human authority, including the authority of the Emperor, ultimately rested on exactly the same foundation as his own rule on Nostramo: fear, pain, the threat of violence. He captured Vulcan, the unkillable Primarch of the Salamanders, and subjected him to every torment he could devise, not because Vulcan was a significant military target, but because Vulcan represented hope. Vulcan believed in human resilience, and the Emperor's dream, and the possibility of something genuinely better, and Curze found that belief physically offensive. he needed to break it. He needed to prove it was false. Vulcan survived, which, in its own way, confirmed Curze's understanding of the universe, even as it denied his specific goal. Of course, the Salamander's Primarch would survive. Of course, the test of hope against cruelty would be inconclusive and unresolved. Of course, there would be no clear answer. That was the shape of everything. His battles against Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, across the Thramas sector, are some of the most tactically interesting engagements of the entire heresy. Curze was a master of terrain, shadow, and psychological warfare. He forced the Lion, who was himself a brilliant and aggressive commander, into a kind of reactive posture that was deeply unfamiliar and frustrating. Their direct confrontations were savage and intimate in the way that Primarch combat tends to be. These godlike beings meeting each other in the dark, with weapons that could tear through tank armor, and doing damage to each other that would kill lesser beings a dozen times over. There was a moment in their last meeting where Curze told the Lion something. He gave him a prophecy, according to the sources. The exact content of what was said has never been revealed. But the Lion left Sagwalsa with an expression on his face that his own warriors struggled to describe. Something had been shown to him that changed him, or at least changed something in how he understood what was coming. Whatever Curze saw for the Lion, he kept as his own. He carried it the way he carried everything, alone. The physical wounds Curze sustained over the course of the heresy were extraordinary. The Lion dealt him 11 distinct wounds during one engagement, each individually fatal to a space marine, and Curze still managed to survive and escape. He was shot, stabbed, and battered by his brothers repeatedly during the course of the Civil War, and kept coming back, kept moving, kept fighting. A war he was not fighting to win, but to demonstrate. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Night Haunter during the heresy. He was not trying to help Horus win. He was trying to make a point. And the point he was trying to make required that the worst happen, because the worst was the only thing that would prove he had been right. By the end of the heresy, with Horus dead and the traitors fleeing, Curze was a figure of profound exhaustion. He had been right. The galaxy had burned. His brothers were dead or scattered or transformed beyond recognition. The great project of the Emperor lay in ruins, with the Emperor himself entombed on the golden throne in a state that was not life and was not quite death. Everything Curze had seen, everything he had tried to warn about, had come to pass exactly as he had foreseen, and he was still here, still alive, still carrying visions. He retreated to Tsagwalsa at the edge of the eastern fringe, and he began to wait. He already knew what was coming. He had seen it for as long as he could remember. The specific violence of the Night Lords during the heresy was not simply a matter of scale, though the scale was genuinely extraordinary. It was distinguished by a quality that even their traitor allies found unsettling, which was the sense of absolute intentionality behind every act. The Night Lords did not commit atrocities because they had lost control, or because their commander was absent, or because the momentum of a battle had carried them somewhere they had not planned to go. They committed them because each one had been thought through. Each choice about who to target and how to target them, and what to leave behind for the people who came after, to find was a calculated decision in service of a specific message. The message was always the same. This is what you are. This is what you have always been. This is what everything you call civilization has at its foundation when you strip away the parts you have agreed not to look at. The Night Lords were not simply killing people. They were conducting demonstrations, and the demonstrations were addressed to an audience that included not only the immediate targets, but the historical record. The future readers of the accounts of what had happened on these worlds, the people who would eventually have to confront the fact that this had occurred and ask themselves what it meant. Curze understood something about historical violence that most of his brothers did not or would not acknowledge, even if they understood it. The act of recording atrocity is itself a form of argument. The decision about which horrors to preserve in the historical record and which to allow to fade into the soft margins of the past is a political act, always, regardless of who makes it. The Imperium's account of the Great Crusade carefully managed the visibility of certain kinds of violence, maintaining the narrative of civilizational expansion while keeping the specific costs of that expansion at a sufficient distance from the central story that they did not disrupt the overall picture. The Night Lords made this management impossible in the territories they operated in. What they did was too visible, too deliberately arranged for maximum observability, too specifically designed to resist the kind of narrative softening that makes institutional violence tolerable to the institutions that commit it. In this sense, Curze was operating as a kind of historian. A brutal one, certainly, and one who manufactured primary sources through the production of historical events, rather than through their description. But a historian nonetheless. He was creating evidence for an argument about the nature of power that he intended to be irrefutable because it would be written in forms that could not be conveniently reinterpreted. His relationship with his Night Lords during the heresy is as revealing as his relationship with his allies or his opponents. By the time of the Civil War, the Legion had absorbed significant numbers of recruits from sources other than Nostromo, which had been destroyed, and the new recruits came with different expectations and different interpretations of what it meant to be a Night Lord. Many of them had joined because the freedom and the darkness and the particular aesthetic of terror appealed to them as individuals. Some had joined because the Night Lords were effective, and effectiveness was what they valued. Very few of them had joined because they understood or shared Curze's philosophical framework, the argument that the Night Lord's methods were supposed to be making. Curze did not require ideological alignment from his sons. He required behavioral alignment, which was achievable through precisely the mechanism he was always advocating. The implicit threat of what the Night Haunter would do to Night Lords who deviated from operational parameters was sufficient to maintain the parameters without ever needing to be explicitly stated. This is not a small irony. He governed his own legion through the exact mechanism he claimed was the universal governing mechanism of all authority. He was both the theorist and the proof of his own thesis in every interaction with his own sons. The battle on Macragge, where Curze found himself facing Vulcans simultaneously with Guilliman and Lionel Johnson in circumstances his visions had guided him toward, without giving him entirely clear advance notice of where they were leading, represents one of the most extraordinary convergences of the heresy. 3 Primarchs in confined spaces, each individually capable of ending virtually any other conflict in the galaxy, fighting in and around civilian infrastructure with consequences for the surrounding population that the tactical reports have never fully captured. The eventual intervention of Cabal operatives, including the use of the Fulgurite weapon on Vulcan and the demonic banishment that drove Curze into the warp, interrupted the engagement before any clear outcome was reached. Curze's time inside the warp after that banishment deserves more attention than it usually receives. He experienced it as weeks, though the warp's relationship with time makes the correspondence to material universe duration uncertain. A Primarch in the warp without the protections that extensive chaos devotion provides is in an environment actively hostile to the kind of coherent selfhood that makes someone recognizably themselves. The warp hungers for strong psychic presences and attempts to consume them, to dissolve the boundaries of individual identity into the ambient soup of emotion and need and endless hunger that constitutes the Imperium's baseline. Curze survived this through the specific quality that had always defined him, the clarity of his own self-understanding. He knew what he was, and he knew what the warp was, and he did not confuse the two, which is the essential skill for endurance in the Imperium. What he absorbed during those weeks, however, is a different question. The warp left its mark on him, not corruption in the doctrinal sense, not the kind of taint that the Inquisition would identify and condemn, but an intimacy with the Imperium's fundamental nature that he had not had before, an understanding of the warp from the inside that complemented his understanding of the material universe from the outside. He emerged carrying something of the warp, the way you carry the smell of a place you have been in for a long time, not visible, not easily describable, but present in the specific way you now hold yourself and the specific things that no longer surprise you. This experience may be relevant to the question of what happened at Sagualsa. A Primarch who has been in the warp and survived it, who understands its nature from the inside, has resources for navigating the boundary between warp and reality that most beings do not possess. The Calidus assassin Machen was an extraordinarily capable individual, but she was a baseline human being with specific augmentations and specific training. Against a Primarch operating with the full benefit of genuine warp interaction experience and perfect prescience, whatever she thought she was doing when she entered that throne room The gap between what she experienced as happening and what was actually happening could have been very wide indeed. Section 5. The Horus Heresy, Curze among the traitors. Let's linger in the heresy itself a little longer, because what Konrad Curze did during those years tells us something crucial about who he was and who he might be if he came back. Most of the traitor primarchs moved through the heresy with discernible goals. Horus wanted to destroy the Emperor and remake the Imperium in a form that acknowledged the truth of chaos. Mortarion wanted to poison the dream that had left him forever dissatisfied. Angron simply wanted to fight, to drown in battle as he had drowned in it since before the Emperor found him. Magnus the Red was operating from a position of increasingly desperate rationalization for choices that had already been made catastrophically wrong. Curze wanted to win an argument. That distinction matters enormously when you consider how it shaped his actions. He had no interest in ruling what came after, assuming anything came after. He had no portfolio of demands that the traitor cause was going to fulfill for him. He was not seeking ascension to daemonhood, the grotesque apotheosis that some of his brothers would eventually undergo, the transformation from Primarch to something even less human and even more powerful in exchange for true devotion to one of the Chaos Gods. The Night Lords paid lip service to the ruinous powers in the way you might acknowledge the weather, recognizing that it was real and that you had to navigate it, without attributing to it any particular moral dimension. Curze operated during the heresy as though he was running a series of experiments. Each world the Night Lords fell upon was another data point. Each population that broke under their assault was another confirmation. Each act of terror that worked, that converted a fighting population into a surrendering one, was one more entry in a ledger that Curze was keeping in his head. The ledger that proved what he had always known, that the mechanism of human society was fear and always had been, regardless of what anyone called it or how they dressed it up. What made him genuinely dangerous beyond the strategic was the absolute lack of performance in his cruelty. This is a distinction that matters. Other Chaos commanders, especially those touched by the gods, performed their atrocities. There was theater to it, spectacle, a kind of Baroque excess that was as much about the doing as the effect. Curze did not perform. He was efficient. He hurt people because hurting people accomplished specific things, and when those things were accomplished, he stopped. There was something in that restraint that the other traitors, even his own Night Lords, found more frightening than theatrical excess would have been. You can maintain distance from spectacle. You cannot maintain distance from cold efficiency. The drop site massacre at Istvan V was where the heresy truly began its darkest chapter, and the Night Lords were there, turning on the loyalist forces that had been drawn into what they believed was a loyalist council. The Raven Guard, the Salamanders, the Iron Hands. All of them were targeted, surrounded, and systematically destroyed over the course of one of the most concentrated acts of mass killing in Space Marine history. Curze fought alongside Lorgar, the Word-Bearer Primarch, against Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard. The Loyalist Primarch barely escaped. Many of his brother's sons did not. After Istvan, the Night Lords spread out across the galaxy in a pattern that defied easy military categorization. They did not follow a campaign plan in the way the Iron Warriors or the World Eaters did. They drifted, descended, terrorized, and moved on. They were a force of psychological attrition, and they were extremely good at it, but they were not building toward anything. Every Night Lord who served under Curze at this time understood, on some level, that the war they were fighting was not a war that could be won in the conventional sense. It was a demonstration, and they were the props. The encounter with Vulcan bears repeating in more detail, because it reveals something important about the limits of Curze's philosophy when it came up against someone who genuinely did not behave the way he expected humanity to behave. Vulcan of the Salamanders was a perpetual, an immortal being who could not permanently die. Whatever was done to him, he would eventually revive. Curze did not know this initially, or he may have suspected it from his visions and simply not fully absorbed the implication. He subjected the Salamander's Primarch to everything his imagination could devise, month after month aboard the Night Lord's fleet, and Vulcan kept coming back, kept refusing to break, kept maintaining, through some combination of constitution and character, the essential shape of who he was. This was the experiment Curze could not make work. He could break anyone, he believed, given enough time and sufficient imagination. Vulcan was evidence that this belief was not universally true, and rather than updating the model, Curze found the result offensive. It was data that contradicted the thesis. He pushed harder. Vulcan escaped. The data point went unintegrated. There is a reading of Curze, and it is one that the primary sources support, that he wanted the experiment to fail. That somewhere underneath the nihilism and the visions and the ironclad certainty that humanity was corrupt and fear was the only true force in the universe, there was a fragment of something that hoped to be disproven, that wanted someone, anyone, to demonstrate through their conduct that he had been wrong, that Nostromo had not taught him the only lesson there was to learn. Vulcan came close, but Vulcan was also a Primarch, genetically engineered to extraordinary specifications, a perpetual and in many ways as superhuman in his resilience as Curze was in his prescience. The lesson, such as it was, could not generalize. You cannot build a philosophy of hope on the fact that one unkillable demigod refused to stay dead. By the closing phases of the heresy, as the siege of Terra ground toward its conclusion, and it became clear that Horus's gambit was approaching its decisive moment one way or another, Curze was operating with diminishing coherence. Not tactical coherence, which remained sharp to the end, but something more fundamental. He was losing the thread of why any of it mattered. He had never believed the traitor cause would succeed. Not really. He had believed it would demonstrate something. But demonstrations require an audience, and the universe does not particularly care about demonstrations. It grinds on regardless. When Horus died, when the War Master was finally killed by the Emperor's last expenditure of nearly everything that remained of him, the traitor cause shattered and scattered. Curze watched this happen. He had seen it coming. And then he did something that no one who did not know his visions could have predicted. He took his legion to Tsagwalsa, dismissed his guards from his throne room, and sat down in the dark to wait for the specific death he had seen for himself since before he had understood what death was. Section 6. The death that was not a death. Tsagwalsa and the final argument. The word Tsagwalsa means something close to carry-on world in the old Nostraman tongue, and Curze chose it deliberately. He had always had a poet's instinct for the weight of words, a talent for symbolic gesture wrapped in something that read to others as pure brutality. The world at the edge of the eastern fringe, that became the Night Lord's base after the heresy, was selected not just for its strategic position, but for what it represented, a world of the dead, a world where things ended. He had a palace built there. This detail is one that takes a moment to sit with. A palace built from living bodies, from people who had been incorporated into its structure while still breathing, their existence preserved just enough to serve as architectural material. It sounds like simple horror, and it was horrible, but it was also a statement, a final, sprawling, architectural version of the argument Curze had been making his entire life. This is what civilization is, he was saying. This is what it is made of, when you strip the stone and mortar away, the suffering of people, the captured and converted agony of the weak, serving the purposes of the powerful. I have simply made the structure visible. I have simply refused to dress it up. From this palace, in the years after the heresy, the Night Lords launched campaigns against the Imperium that made their earlier atrocities look measured by comparison. They no longer had the constraints of being part of a larger military operation. They no longer needed to keep their behavior within the margins of anything resembling organized warfare. They were free, and freedom for the Night Lords was a kind of apocalypse. They descended on world after world in the eastern fringe, and did things that even the most hardened imperial historians have difficulty recording with neutrality. Curze directed this, less with the precision of a commander and more with the passive permission of a man who had simply stopped having reasons to stop anything. He sat in his palace made of people and received his visions and waited for the one that mattered. The assassin Mährchen was a Calidus operative, which meant she was trained in the arts of disguise, infiltration, and targeted killing beyond what most imperial operatives could dream of. Calidus assassins used a drug called polymorphine that allowed them to physically alter their body structure, to wear different faces and different forms, to slip through security measures that depended on recognizing a specific person. They were the officio assassinorum's answer to the kind of target that could not be reached with a sniper rifle from a rooftop. the targets who existed inside layers of protection, inside communities, inside structures that would recognize an outside threat before it got close. Curze presented M'Shen with none of these challenges. He had seen her coming. He saw her face, the specific shape of her movements through the palace corridors, the moment of her entrance into his throne room. He had seen all of it for so long, it felt like memory rather than prophecy. He ordered his guards to stand down. He sent them away. He sat in the darkness of his own making and let the mechanisms of the Imperium he had spent his entire existence fighting do exactly what he had always said they would do. The recording that survived from the palace's vid capture systems showed M'Shen moving through empty corridors, encountering no resistance, finding the Primarch exactly where he was, and appearing to do exactly what she had been sent to do. And then the recording ends. Not with any ceremony or final image of resolution. It simply stops. The feed cuts out. His last words were spoken directly into the recording, addressed to the Emperor. He said, "In the version that has been preserved and debated and written about for 10 millennia of in-universe history, I merely punished those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication. This is not the statement of a broken man. This is not the last words of someone who has given up. This is the closing argument of a case Curze had been building his entire life, delivered at the moment of maximum rhetorical impact. He was right that the Emperor used the same mechanisms he did. He was right that the Imperium, for all its rhetoric about law and civilization, ultimately maintained itself through the threat of exactly the kind of violence that Curze had been condemned for. And by sitting in that throne room and accepting the assassin's blade, he proved it. The Emperor of mankind, who claimed to stand for something higher, had sent a killer instead of a judge. But here is where the ambiguity lives. Here is where the lore left the door open, just wide enough to let the darkness breathe. The recording ends before anyone can confirm what actually happened. M'Shen was known afterward to have escaped Tsagwalsa with certain items she had taken from the body, or from what she claimed was the body, including what the Night Lords considered sacred relics. The Night Lords, in their grief and rage, broke Curze's last direct order and pursued her across the galaxy. The Soul Hunter, Talos Valkoran, eventually caught M'Shen and killed her. Before she died, she had the recording. A copy of it was eventually circulated among the Night Lords' warbands, and it was described as the first time many Night Lords had seen their Gene Father's face in 10,000 years. But the kill was never confirmed. The video feed cut out at the critical moment. No body was positively identified, because Primarchs are not easy to destroy, and the Night Lords in their chaos and grief were not in the state of mind for careful forensic procedure. There is a theory, present in fan discussion and hinted at in certain sources, that the Corona Nox, the crown that Curze wore, may have had properties that preserved something of its wearer. There is the simple fact that a Primarch, even one who seemingly wanted to die, has resources that most beings do not. And there is the visions. Curze saw everything. He knew when M'Shen was coming. He knew his exact manner of death, down to, as the lore states, the appointed hour. He had seen his own end with complete clarity. But what had he seen after? The lore never tells us. And that silence, 10,000 years of it, growing louder in a galaxy that has lately become far more willing to return its dead, suggests that whatever Curze saw beyond Tsagwalsa was something he kept to himself. Something he may have been preparing for. The years between the heresy's end and the arrival of M'Shen represent one of the most poorly documented periods in Night Lords history, which is itself significant. The Night Lords were active. They were conducting operations. The scale and brutality of what they did on the worlds of the Eastern Fringe during this period was, by the accounts of Imperial historians who could bring themselves to document it, extraordinary, even by the standards of a post-heresy galaxy that had seen much. But Curze himself is largely absent from the records of this period, not because he was inactive, but because the records that survive are the ones that were deliberately preserved, and the Night Haunter was not preserving records of his own activities during this phase. He was doing something else. He was finishing something. The document he called The Dark, the memoirs that he reportedly completed in the final hours before M'Shen arrived, represents the capstone of a project that had been ongoing for his entire adult existence. He was not simply recording what had happened to him. He was constructing the final version of the argument, the version that did not need to be made verbally to anyone in the present, because it was addressed to the future, to whoever found it, to whoever was in a position, at some point in the galaxy's subsequent history, to read it and understand what it meant. The document was hidden, not destroyed, not transmitted, not given to any of his Night Lords to preserve. Hidden somewhere in the palace on Sagwalsa, in a place that Curze's visions had shown him would not be discovered at the wrong moment, in a place whose existence was not known to M'Shen, or to the Night Lords who investigated the palace afterward, or to whoever eventually settled the world in the millennia that followed. Hidden for a specific future reader in a specific future moment. This is not the behavior of a man accepting death as a philosophical endpoint. This is the behavior of a man arranging for the continuation of something past the apparent ending. The argument in The Dark, whatever it contains, is addressed to someone who will be able to make use of it. The hiding place was selected through precognitive knowledge of when it would be found and by whom. The content was shaped by the same knowledge. The question of who eventually finds the Dark, if it has not yet been found, and what it contains, is one of the genuine open mysteries of the current setting. If Curze returns, he presumably knows where it is. He presumably knows whether it has been found yet, and by whom, and what they did with it. His prescience would have shown him all of this decades or centuries before the relevant events, the same way it showed him M'Shen's arrival years before she came. The Corona Nox, the crown that M'Shen took and Zo Sahal eventually recovered after boarding her escape vessel in the chaos following the assassination, deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of Curze's death. The lore describes it as a symbol of authority, the physical representation of the Night Haunter's primacy over the Night Lords. But in Warhammer 40,000, physical objects of significant psychic or historical weight are rarely merely symbolic. The setting is full of artifacts whose significance is functional rather than representational, objects that do something beyond what their appearance suggests. The Corona Nox was worn by a Primarch. It was in constant contact with a being of extraordinary psychic significance for the entirety of Curze's post-heresy existence. Whatever the Chaos Gods could not directly claim of Curze's soul, the Corona Nox had been absorbing the overflow of his presence for decades after the heresy, accumulating the specific psychic residue of a being who saw the future clearly and who was, in the final period of his existence, very deliberately managing what he left behind. A crown that has absorbed that kind of presence, that has sat on the head of the Night Haunter while he was writing his final argument and arranging his final demonstration, is not a simple piece of metalwork. Zo Sahal carried it into the warp for 10,000 years. That is a significant detail. An object with that level of psychic charge, in the warp for 10 millennia, would have accumulated something during that time. The warp is not a neutral storage environment. It is a living realm of psychic energy that interacts with everything that enters it, amplifying some aspects and distorting others, and adding its own character to whatever it contains. Sahal's eventual emergence from the warp after his long stasis brought the Corona Nox back to the material universe, but what came back with it is not necessarily exactly what went in. And then there is the simple question of what Curze saw when he looked at M'Shen's attack. He had seen the appointed hour. He knew exactly when she would be in the room with him. He knew, because he had seen it, what the final outcome of that moment looked like from the outside, what it would appear to be to anyone observing or studying the records afterward. But knowing what something looks like is not the same as knowing what it is. He could have arranged for the apparent outcome to be death without the actual outcome being death, and he would have done so precisely because his visions showed him that the apparent outcome was necessary for whatever came after. The galaxy needed to believe the Night Haunter was dead for the next phase to unfold correctly. Just as an argument sometimes needs to reach its apparent conclusion before the real conclusion becomes visible. His last words, the recorded transmission, were addressed to the Emperor, not to his legion, not to posterity. To the Emperor, who was at that point entombed on the Golden Throne, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers a day, not dead but not alive in any meaningful sense. Curze was addressing the most powerful psychic presence in the galaxy, a being who, whatever his physical condition, retained extraordinary reach in the warp and could perceive things that no other entity could perceive. The transmission was not, in this reading, simply a philosophical statement about vindication. It was a message. addressed to the only being in the galaxy who might be capable of receiving and understanding it, and capable of acting on it in the specific way that whatever came next required. The Emperor could not speak, he could not act directly, but he could perceive. And what the Night Haunter said to him in those final recorded words, before the feed cut out, may have contained more than the surface meaning, may have been the delivery of information that only the Emperor could hold safely, that only the Emperor's peculiar post-Golden Throne existence could keep in a form accessible to the right moment. This is deeply speculative, and I want to be clear about that, but it is speculation built on the specific qualities of the characters involved. Curze had perfect foresight. The Emperor had perfect breadth of psychic perception. Two beings of this caliber, in a final exchange, with 10,000 years of consequences on the other side of it, were not simply engaging in rhetoric. Whatever was transmitted in those last moments was doing something specific. The drama of the statement served the moment it was in. What was underneath the drama served something larger. Section 7. 10,000 years without a father. The Night Lords adrift. The Night Lords without Konrad Curze are one of the most fascinating tragedies in the entire setting, and they deserve their own careful attention before we get to the question of what happens if he comes back, because understanding what they have become in his absence is essential to understanding what his return would actually mean. When Curze died, or when he appeared to die, the Night Lords were already a fragmented force. The heresy and its aftermath had scattered the Legion across the galaxy in a pattern that owed more to the currents of the warp than to any coherent strategy. Some warship fleets had been operating independently for years before the fall of Horus, pursuing their own campaigns with whatever level of attachment to the larger cause suited the captain's current mood. The Night Lords had always had a loose relationship with centralized command, because Curze himself had always had a loose relationship with the idea that anyone else's plans mattered more than his own visions. After Tsagualsa, that looseness became complete disorder. The Legion fragmented into warbands. Individual captains or aspiring leaders gathered around themselves, whatever warriors they could hold through force of personality, reputation, or genuine military competence, and these groups went their separate ways. Some retreated into the Eye of Terror, that ancient wound in space where chaos bleeds freely, and the laws of reality are suggestions rather than requirements. Some continued operating in the Eastern Fringe, using Tsagualsa or nearby worlds as staging grounds for raids on Imperial targets. Some drifted into the wider galaxy, attaching themselves temporarily to other traitor operations when it served them, and detaching when it did not. What the Night Lords categorically refused to do was unify around any kind of larger cause. They did not become devoted servants of any single chaos god. They did not pledge themselves to Abaddon the Despoiler and the Black Legion's endless crusades against the Cadian Gate. They did not integrate into any of the grand structures that other traitor legions eventually built for themselves or joined. The Night Lords remained, in every sense of the word, their own, answerable to nothing, bound by nothing, pursuing their own definition of purpose with the grim independence of people who had learned that outside authority was either cowardly or corrupt, and were not particularly interested in testing whether their current sample was representative. The individual warbands have their own distinct characters. The warband of Krieg Acerbus, noted in Imperial records as the largest and most chaotic of the Night Lords' current factions, operates with an excess that would have appalled Curze himself. They are less a military unit than a moving atrocity, driven by appetite rather than philosophy. At the other end of the spectrum are warbands that still operate with something approaching the original Night Lords doctrine, deploying in organized Legiones Astartes fashion with specific military goals, using terror as a tool rather than an end in itself. And then there is Jo Sahal, the heir apparent who Curze had designated as his successor through the Corona Nox, the crown that was supposed to pass from Primarch to Champion and carry with it the authority of the Night Haunter's legacy. Sahal boarded Mishen's escape vessel and retrieved the Corona Nox, and then his own ship was ambushed by Eldar raiders and dragged into the warp, where he remained for nearly 10,000 years, conscious in stasis, waiting for a rescue that took millennia to arrive. He resurfaced into the current era, having missed the entire Dark Age of the Imperium, the Long War, all of it, carrying a claim to leadership that other Night Lords' warlords had spent 10 millennia building their own power against. His story is a separate tragedy wrapped inside the larger one. In the fiction, the most significant treatment of the Night Lords in the current era comes from Aaron Dembski-Bowden's celebrated Night Lords trilogy, which centers on Talos Valkoren, the Soul Hunter. Talos is a former apothecary who has inherited a fragment of Curze's prophetic gift, seeing visions that are both blessing and curse, accurate and debilitating. He leads a small warband called First Claw as part of a larger operation, navigating the politics of a fractured legion while trying to maintain some version of identity and purpose in a galaxy that has moved on without them. What makes Talos compelling, and what makes the trilogy so highly regarded, is that he is a monster who knows he is a monster. He is capable of genuine attachment to his warband, to the humans they sometimes protect against worse threats, to the memory of a father figure he barely knew, but whose genetic curse he carries in his blood. And he is also capable of extraordinary cruelty, of acts that are indefensible by any measure, of choices that he makes with full awareness of what they mean. He lives in that contradiction, without resolving it, which is exactly the space that Curze himself inhabited for his entire existence. At the end of the trilogy, a figure named Decimus appears. Decimus is prophesied to be the one who will reunite the Night Lords, the figure who inherits enough of Curze's characteristics to serve as a focal point for the scattered warbands. He carries the precognitive gift. He has the potential to be what Curze was, or what Curze could have been if he had made different choices at certain critical junctions. But the Night Lords trilogy ended where it ended, and Decimus's story remains unresolved. Whether he fulfills the prophecy, whether the Night Lords as a legion ever find their way back to something coherent, remains one of the open questions of the setting. It is a question that becomes significantly more complicated if the source of that unifying potential were to return, not as a symbolic echo, but as the original. What the Night Lords have become in the 42nd millennium, after the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, is both their most powerful and their most nihilistic incarnation. They are absolutely in their element. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the great wound across reality that divided the Imperium into two halves and plunged half of it into the darkness of the Noctis Aeterna, created conditions that might as well have been designed specifically for the Night Lord's playbook. Worlds cut off from Terra and the light of the Astronomicon, communication networks failing, populations thrown into panic and despair, the machinery of imperial authority grinding to a halt in thousands of isolated systems. The Night Lords descended on this chaos like they were built for it, because they were. They have established small empires in isolated systems. They have used demonic pacts to create false, safe passages through the Great Rift and then ambush the Imperial fleets desperate enough to use them. They have launched more raids against the Imperium since the Rift opened than in any comparable period since the heresy itself. They are thriving by every metric that applies to them, which is to say they are causing suffering at an industrious pace. But they are still fractured. They are still answerable to nothing. They are still the shattered remnants of a legion that needed someone to lead it somewhere, and has not had that someone for 10,000 years. That absence is a wound in the Night Lords that even their most effective warbands cannot quite close. You can feel it in the lore. You can feel it in the stories of individual Night Lords who do extraordinary things and have nowhere for those things to point. Talos' entire arc is essentially grief, the grief of someone trying to find meaning in a legacy that was never finished. The Night Lords are perhaps the only traitor legion whose defining characteristic is not what they are, but what they lost. And what they lost is waiting in the shadows of Tsagwalsa, in a question that the lore never fully answered. The specific contributions of individual Night Lords' warbands to the Long War over the millennia represent a pattern that is consistent with the fragmentation narrative, but also shows that even without central leadership, the Night Lords carried something of Curze's legacy forward in ways that were not simply reduced to mindless predation. The fall of Villimus, for example, saw Night Lords under the Exalted's warband cooperate with Huron Blackheart's Red Corsairs in sacking the fortress monastery of the Marines' Errant chapter. This was a deliberate, coordinated operation against a fortified Space Marine position, not a simple raid against a civilian target. It required planning, intelligence gathering, and the kind of sustained military coordination that the Night Lords in their more nihilistic phases often avoided. The operation succeeded, the fortress fell, and the subsequent breakdown of the alliance into violent conflict between the Night Lords and the Red Corsairs, who had helped them take it, was thoroughly Night Lords in character. But the initial success was evidence that the Legion retained genuine military capability when motivated by appropriate targets. The Kaijan Uprising showed another dimension of the Night Lords' post-heresy operations. They inserted themselves into an Imperial world's internal rebellion, aiding the planetary population in revolting against the Imperium, becoming embroiled in what ultimately became one of the most bitter urban battles in recent history. The Night Lords' involvement in this conflict was not benevolent. They were not helping the rebels because they cared about the rebels' cause. They were exploiting the conflict to demonstrate a specific point and to harvest the particular kind of suffering that civil war produces. But the sophistication of the intervention, the understanding that one faction's rebellion against another could be weaponized, was a remnant of Curze's own approach to conflict as demonstration rather than pure destruction. Scound's fall was perhaps the most audacious operation in the Night Lords' post-heresy record, a raid against an Imperial world within 100 light-years of Terra itself. The symbolism was deliberate, the Night Lords' equivalent of leaving a message at the center of power saying, "You cannot protect even your nearest neighbors. You cannot be everywhere. The dark reaches where your light does not." The operation succeeded, and the Night Lords left, because staying was not the point. The point was the raid itself, the evidence of the Imperium's inability to guarantee safety even in the heart of its own territory. These operations, scattered across millennia and spread across the galaxy without any coordinating purpose, nonetheless add up to something recognizable as the Night Lord's character. The capacity for precise, deliberate, symbolically loaded operations that make specific points rather than simply accumulating tactical victories. The preference for interventions that leave populations changed, specifically afraid, aware of the Night Lord's presence in ways that linger long after the warriors themselves have moved on. The specific and consistent targeting of psychological vulnerability over structural weakness, choosing targets not for their military significance, but for their significance to the populations, watching what happens to them. This is Curze's legacy, present in his sons even 10,000 years after his apparent death, not transmitted through any formal system of doctrine or tradition, because the Night Lords do not have formal systems in that sense. Transmitted through the gene seed itself, through the specific qualities that Curze's biology embedded in the 8th Legion's genetic heritage, through the visions that some Night Lords still carry as a ghost of their Primarch's gift. The Night Haunter is in them, the way that certain experiences are in people who survive them, not as memory exactly, but as a shape that the world has taken on because of what happened in it. The question of whether this constitutes a legacy in any meaningful sense, whether the Night Lord's current activities honor what Curze was trying to do, or merely perpetuate a distorted version of it, stripped of its philosophical content, is one that figures like Talos Valcorin have asked explicitly without being able to resolve. The Night Lords of the current era are very good at what they do. They are expert at spreading fear and breaking populations and operating in the dark. They are considerably less good at being what Curze actually was, which was a figure for whom the terror was always in service of an argument, always connected to a claim about the universe that the terror was meant to demonstrate. Without the argument, the Night Lords are very effective predators. With the argument, returned and articulated by the only being who could articulate it with the authority of the original, they become something more dangerous and more interesting. They become the thing Curze always intended. The demonstration that does not merely hurt but illuminates, the darkness that reveals by contrast rather than simply by consuming. Section 8. The Great Rift and the Perfect Storm. The Great Rift did not come quietly. It did not announce itself with portents or give anyone time to prepare. It tore across reality at the end of the 41st millennium, in a moment that followed decades of escalating crisis, and it remade the galaxy with the kind of thoroughness that only genuine catastrophe can manage. The immediate trigger was the fall of Cadia, the fortress world that had guarded the only stable passage through the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years. When Abaddon the Despoiler launched his 13th Black Crusade and succeeded in destroying the Cadian pylons, the network of ancient Necron technology that had been holding the Eye of Terror in check, the energies contained within the Eye began to bleed outward in ways that had no precedent since the Age of Strife. Simultaneously, the Eldar god Ynid was partially awakened by events related to chaos, and the birth cry of a new deity resonated through the warp in ways that destabilized barriers that had been in place since the foundations of the Imperium. The result was the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Cursed Scar, a galaxy-wide tear in reality stretching from the Eye of Terror in the northwest of the galaxy to the Hadex Anomaly in the far east, effectively splitting the Milky Way into two halves. The western half, Imperium Sanctus, remained reachable by the light of the Astronomicon and retained connection to Terra and the machinery of imperial administration, however compromised. The eastern half, now called the Dark Imperium, or Imperium Nihilus, was effectively isolated, cut off from the Emperor's psychic beacon, thrown into a period of darkness called the Noctis Aeterna, during which warp travel became nearly impossible, and thousands of worlds were left to face whatever came for them without support or rescue. This is the backdrop against which the question of Konrad Curze's return needs to be understood. Because the galaxy that existed when Curze died is not the galaxy that exists now, and the changes that have occurred since his apparent death at Sagwalsa have created conditions that seem almost tailor-made to enable, or even demand, his reappearance. Consider what the Great Rift represents in terms of the balance of power. Before it opened, the Imperium was a struggling but coherent entity, fighting wars on multiple fronts but maintaining the basic structure that the Emperor had built and Robut Guilliman had preserved and maintained. After it opened, the Imperium is something closer to two separate entities, one of which is relatively functional, and one of which is a collection of isolated worlds trying to survive independently without the support structure that makes survival possible. The Dark Imperium is exactly the kind of environment where a sufficiently powerful and sufficiently motivated force could carve out a genuine domain. The Night Lords are already doing this on a small scale. Individual warbands have established what the Lexicanum describes as small empires among systems cut off from the Emperor's light. They are filling the power vacuum that the Great Rift created in the Dark Imperium, not with any coherent governance or long-term vision, but with fear and force, and the particular kind of dominance that the Night Lords have always been best at. They are thriving as a collection of independent operations. But small empires are not the same thing as an empire, and the Night Lords, brilliant and ruthless and skilled as they individually are, have always suffered from the absence of a central purpose. Curze was that purpose, not because he told them what to do, but because he was the argument they were all making, the walking proof of the thesis that fear was the only real power in the universe, and that pretending otherwise was the first step toward corruption. Without him, the Night Lords are making the argument without being able to point to the proof. They are telling a story that everyone has forgotten the first chapter of. The Great Rift also has another dimension that is relevant to Curze specifically. It increased the number and power of psychers across the galaxy dramatically. The Psychic Awakening, as it has been termed, is a galaxy-wide phenomenon tied to the opening of the Rift, a surge in psychic potential among human and alien populations alike that represents both opportunity and crisis. More powerful psychers means more potential for the kinds of abilities that Curze possessed, more prophetic visions, more precognitive sensitivity to the currents of the warp, and more connection, potentially, to whatever remains of a Primarch, whose existence always operated outside the warp's usual rules, but who certainly left an impression in the Immaterium over the course of a life as extraordinary as his. There is something else to consider, something that the lore has made increasingly pointed over the course of recent editions. Games Workshop has established a pattern. The return of the Primarchs is not random. Each edition of the game has brought back a major figure in ways that reshuffled the narrative landscape. Robut Guilliman returned in the 8th edition era, dragging the Indomitus Crusade into being and giving the Imperium a commander who could actually coordinate the response to the endless crises. Lion L. Johnson returned in the 10th edition era, awakening from his millennia of healing sleep within the rock to confront a dark Imperium that desperately needed his brand of ruthless competence. On the traitor side, Magnus, the Red, and Mortarion both received Daemon Primarch rules and significant narrative attention in previous editions. The 10th edition era saw Fulgrim, the Daemon Primarch of the Emperor's Children, emerge with full rules and his own narrative weight. The pattern continues. Each major faction gets its moment. The Night Lords have not had theirs. Konrad Curze is the Night Lords. His return would be their moment. And in a galaxy split by the Great Rift, with half of known space plunged into darkness, with the Night Lords at their most active and most successful since the heresy, with the philosophical questions Curze spent his life asking more relevant than ever, in a setting where the Imperium's methods of maintaining itself have become increasingly indistinguishable from the methods of its enemies. The stage is set. The question is not really if, the question is how, and after that, what it would mean. Section 9. How could he come back? The pathways through the dark. This is the section where we have to be careful about the boundary between lore and speculation, and I want to be upfront about that. What we know for certain from canon sources is that Konrad Curze's death was never definitively confirmed within the fiction, that certain properties of the Night Haunter's biology and equipment have been left deliberately ambiguous, and that the general mechanism of Primarch returns has been established through multiple examples in recent years. What follows is a careful assembly of the possibilities that the lore has left open, with appropriate flagging of where we are moving from established fact into reasonable inference. The first possibility, and the one most consistent with Curze's own stated philosophy about fate, is that he never died at Sagwalsa in the way that everyone assumed. He saw the entire sequence of his death in his visions. He knew M'Shen was coming. He knew the exact hour and manner of what was supposed to happen. But Curze also knew, from a lifetime of experience with his own precognitive ability, that the future was not a fixed track, that the present simply ran along without any possibility of intervention. His visions showed him what would happen given the current trajectory. He had spent his entire life making choices based on what he saw coming, sometimes trying to prevent it and sometimes deliberately allowing it. The choice to allow M'Shen entry to his palace was conscious and deliberate. But what if the choice was more complex than simple acceptance? What if what Curze allowed was not his death, but the appearance of his death? The vidlog cuts out at the critical moment. M'Shen escaped with relics, and what she claimed was evidence of the kill, but no Primarch body was ever produced, examined, and confirmed by parties with the expertise and the incentive to verify it carefully. The Night Lords in their grief and rage pursued M'Shen for vengeance, not for forensics. They recovered certain items. They accepted the assassination as fact because it matched what they had understood Curze to have wanted. But acceptance of a story because it fits your expectations is not the same thing as verification. This pathway requires that Curze had a plan beyond the plan everyone knew about. It requires that the nihilist philosopher who accepted death as vindication also had one more move in reserve, one final act of strategic vision that remained hidden even from his own legion. Given what we know about him, this is not implausible. He was always playing multiple levels simultaneously. He told Lionel Johnson something in their final meeting that changed the Lion in ways that were never fully revealed. He had secrets he kept, even from the visions that had defined his existence. A man who could see the future and spent his entire life being smarter than the people around him would not necessarily have given up simply because the ending of the story had been visible to him for decades. The second pathway is more cosmological and moves through the warp. The Night Haunter's precognitive ability was stated to be independent of the warp, not a product of it. But that does not mean the warp has no claim on a Primarch's soul. The Primarchs were creatures of immense psychic significance, beings who left enormous impressions in the immaterium, regardless of what specific relationship they had with it. When a Primarch died, they did not simply stop existing in any metaphysical sense. The warp carries echoes of everything sufficiently powerful and sufficiently emotionally weighted. The Chaos Gods feed on these echoes and sometimes incorporate them into their own existence. Curze, however, presents an unusual case. He never pledged himself to any of the 4 Chaos Gods. He acknowledged the ruinous powers without serving them, which put his soul in an interesting position upon death. He was not collected by any god's attention, the way that fully devout traitor Primarchs might have been. He was not protected by the Emperor's psykercraft, the way loyalist Primarchs might have been. He existed in a kind of metaphysical independence that, in the warp, might translate to a kind of freedom that other souls do not have. There are fan theories, some with loose lore support and some without, that the Corona Nox served a preservative function beyond the merely symbolic. The crown of the Night Lords, the symbol of authority that M'Shen took and Zo-Sahal recovered, has never had its exact nature fully explained. It is possible that it served as a psychic anchor, a means of tethering something of Curze's essence to the material world in a way that simple physical death would not disrupt. The lore is silent on this, which, in a setting where narrative gaps are sometimes deliberate, is itself significant. The third pathway is the Daemon Primarch route, the mechanism that has been used most visibly in recent editions to bring back traitor Primarchs. Mortarion was elevated to Daemon Primarch status, becoming a being of immense power that combined his original nature with the full gifts of Nurgle. Magnus the Red existed as a Demon Primarch from relatively early in the heresy's aftermath. Angron of the World Eaters and Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children have both been given Daemon Primarch status and current narrative relevance. Curze is the notable absence from this list. He is the one traitor Primarch who never underwent the apotheosis into daemonhood that most of his brothers eventually did. There are in-universe reasons for this, primarily that he never sought the Chaos God's favor and had no particular investment in their patronage, but the lore has established that an individual's preferences do not always determine the Chaos God's decisions about who they elevate. Power serves power. If the Night Haunter's soul retained sufficient strength and independence in the warp after Tsagwalsa, it is not impossible that one of the gods, or perhaps Chaos Undivided, acting through all four simultaneously, saw something worth preserving and preserving it. A Daemon Primarch Curze would be a different being from the Curze who died on Tsagwalsa. The apotheosis changes a Primarch, not always in ways that destroy who they were, but always in ways that amplify and transform. Angron became more purely cornate than he had ever been in life. His suffering transformed into divine fury. Fulgrim became the perfect expression of Slaaneish's philosophy, beauty and excess made manifest in a being of god-tier power. Mortarion became the pale lord of plague, his lifelong death wish transformed into something that walked through decay and emerged unbroken. What would a Daemon Curze become? What would the Chaos God's gifts do to a being who had always been defined by the knowledge of what was coming and the weight of carrying that knowledge alone? A Curze who retained his visions, but was freed from the physical limitations of mortal suffering, who could move through the galaxy as something more than even a Primarch had ever been, who came back not as a general fighting a battle, but as a walking, breathing proof that the darkness never truly ends, and that death is not the conclusion he had allowed everyone to believe it was. The philosophical implications of his return changed dramatically based on the mechanism. A physically surviving Curze, who had been hiding in the shadows of Tsagwalsa for 10,000 years, comes back with the weight of that concealment, with the question of what he was doing all that time, with the need to explain himself to a legion that mourned him. A Daemon Primarch Curze, who emerges from the warp in the era of the Great Rift, comes back transformed, wearing his old nature, but wearing it in a new way, potentially terrifying in ways that even the original Night Haunter did not manage. There is a fourth pathway that is less commonly discussed, but arguably the most lore-consistent, given what we know about Curze's character. His own prophecy. He saw things beyond Tsagwalsa. He had to have. His visions were not selective, not limited to any particular time horizon. If he saw his death, he saw what came after. He prepared for what came after. The preparations he made may be embedded in the Night Lord's current state, in structures and schemes and individuals who carry aspects of the plan forward without knowing that they are doing so, in a way that only the returning principle can fully activate. Decimus, the prophesied unifier of the Night Lords, may not be the next Night Haunter. He may be the mechanism by which the original Night Haunter reconnects with his legion. These are the paths, some more certain than others, some more supported by the text than others, all of them grounded in the specific properties of the lore that Games Workshop has chosen to leave ambiguous rather than resolving cleanly. The death that was not confirmed. The visions that extended beyond the apparent end. The galaxy that has broken in ways that reward the Night Lords and punish exactly the kind of civilizational confidence that Curze spent his life arguing against. The shadow is the right shape for something to come back through. There is also a fifth pathway that is perhaps the most interesting and the least commonly considered, which is the pathway through the Night Lord's own genetic inheritance. Curze's precognitive ability did not die entirely with him, or with the apparent death at Tsagwalsa. It was transmitted, in diminished and often erratic form, through the gene seed that his sons carried. Talos Valcorin carried it. Certain other Night Lords have reported visions of varying accuracy and varying intensity throughout the millennia since the heresy. The gift persists in the line, weaker and less reliable than the original, but recognizably descended from it. If Curze's ability was passed on through his gene seed, it is not impossible that other aspects of his existence, things that operated at a level that is not simply physical, but that intersects with the specific metaphysical properties of Primarch biology, were also transmitted, preserved, or at least echoed in the descendants who carry his genetic signature. The warp is full of echoes. The psychic impressions that significant beings leave behind them can persist for millennia in the Imperium, attached to objects, to places, to the descendants who carry something of the original in their own substance. A Primarch who designed his own apparent death, and who had spent years before that apparent death, arranging things in the warp through the specific interface that his unusual ability provided, might have left more than echoes. He might have left anchors, points in the Night Lord's genetic line where something of his essence was deliberately embedded, waiting for a specific moment, or a specific person, or a specific convergence of circumstances to activate what was stored there. Decimus, the figure at the end of the Night Lord's trilogy, who carries Curze's gift in a form that is stronger than what most Night Lords inherit, may be exactly this kind of anchor point. Not a reincarnation, not a replacement, but an activation mechanism. A key in a lock that Curze designed before his apparent death and planted in his own genetic inheritance with the patience of a being who knew he had millennia to wait for the right moment. If this is the pathway, then Decimus's role in the reunion of the Night Lords is not to be the next Night Haunter. It is to be the vector by which the original Night Haunter reconnects with his scattered and fragmented children. The figure who catalyzes the reunion, not the figure who leads it. The preparation, not the destination. This framework would explain the specific character of the prophecies about Decimus that appear in the Night Lord's fiction. He is not described as a new Primarch, or a new god, or a new supreme authority. He is described as a unifier, a focal point, a gathering mechanism. Something draws the warbands toward him, and through him, toward something larger, that no individual warband's leadership had the scope to perceive. That something larger, if the framework holds, is the returning presence of the being who designed the gathering in the first place. The mechanism of return, whichever pathway it actually takes, would need to account for the 10,000 years of the Night Lord's independent development. Curze would not be returning to a clean slate, to a legion in the condition he left it. He would be returning to a collection of warbands with 10 millennia of their own history, their own traditions, their own internal hierarchies, and conflicts and power structures. Each warband commander is a significant figure who has earned their position through exactly the kind of demonstrated capability that the Night Lords have always respected. They are not going to simply fold because their gene father has returned. What they would recognize, all of them, regardless of how resistant any individual commander might be to acknowledging it, is the precognitive quality of a genuine Night Haunter. The visions have always been the mark of Curze's specific inheritance, and the visions in their original strength and accuracy are something that no Night Lord currently alive carries. Talos had a version. The version he had was powerful enough to mark him as special within the Legion, to make his insights valuable and his predictions sought after. If the Night Haunter returns with the full original gift, undiminished by the biology that had carried it in its mortal form, and potentially enhanced by whatever the warp or 10,000 years of preparation has done to it, every Night Lord who has ever experienced a fragment of the gift will feel the difference immediately. That recognition would not necessarily produce love or loyalty. The Night Lords are not a legion that produces those responses easily, but it would produce respect in the specific Night Lord's manner, which is the recognition that something exists which you cannot afford to ignore or dismiss, which demands your attention, even if that attention takes the form of wariness rather than devotion. And respect, for the Night Lords, is the beginning of alignment, the beginning of coalescing around something because it is the most significant force in the vicinity, and even the most independent warband commanders understand that significant forces in the vicinity need to be addressed rather than simply ignored. The Night Haunter would not have to command them. He would simply have to be present, to demonstrate through his precognitive accuracy and his strategic vision and the specific quality of his understanding, what the difference was between the scattered warband's current existence and what they could be with him. The demonstration, as always, would be the argument. The argument would be his return itself. Section 10. What his return changes. Everything means everything. Now we get to the part of this discussion that is the most speculative and also the most important, because the question of what Konrad Curze's return would actually mean for the setting is where the full implications of this figure's existence. Let us start with the smallest scale and work outward. For the Night Lords themselves, the return of their Gene Father would be the most transformative event since his death. The Legion is currently a collection of individually effective warbands with no shared direction, no unifying purpose beyond the general appetite for terror and raiding, and no figure whose authority all of them would be forced to acknowledge. They have been building small empires in the Dark Imperium, carving out territory in the chaos after the Great Rift, and doing it well, but doing it as independent operators who cooperate occasionally when it serves them and compete or ignore each other the rest of the time. Curze's return would immediately fracture this comfortable arrangement, and the fracture would be violent before it was anything else. 10,000 years of independent warlordism produces individuals with entrenched positions and genuine power who are not going to simply defer to a returning father figure without being convinced that doing so serves their interests. The Night Lords are not sentimental. They are also not idiots. They would recognize that the return of their Primarch changes the strategic calculus significantly, but recognition is not the same as immediate submission. The process by which the Night Lords would reconsolidate around Curze is probably one of the most interesting narrative spaces in the setting, and it would almost certainly involve significant internal violence before it involved anything else. This is not a weakness. This is consistent with who the Night Lords are. They prove things by demonstrating them. Curze would prove that he deserved to be followed by doing what he always did, being right, being prescient, showing up at the exact right moment with the exact right understanding of what was happening, and demonstrating through action that following him led somewhere worth going. For the Night Lords, the somewhere worth going is not a destination they have had for 10,000 years. Curze's return gives them that destination. It transforms them from a collection of raiding parties into something with a strategic purpose. And in the context of the Dark Imperium, where entire sectors are isolated and vulnerable, a unified Night Lords force with a Primarch at its head and a millennium of accumulated warbands to draw from would be a genuinely galaxy-threatening force. But the Night Lords are only the beginning of what changes. Consider the other traitor legions and factions, particularly Abaddon and the Black Legion. Abaddon has spent 10,000 years building the authority of the War Master of Chaos, constructing a position that acknowledges no equals and demands loyalty from all the traitor factions that operate in his shadow. He has never been entirely successful at this, because the traitor legions are individuals with their own histories and grievances and ambitions, but the Black Legion represents the most successful attempt to organize the forces of chaos into something coherent since the heresy itself. A returning Konrad Curze would be the most significant challenge to Abaddon's authority since Magnus, and it would be a challenge of a fundamentally different kind. Magnus challenges through power and occult capability. Angron challenges through sheer violence. Curze would challenge through philosophy and strategy, and through the specific claim that the Night Lords owe their loyalty to their own Gene Father and their own tradition and nothing else. He would not want to replace Abaddon as War Master of Chaos, because that role requires buying into a framework of chaos allegiance that Curze never embraced. He would want to be something outside Abaddon's structure entirely, and the Night Lord's willingness to follow him, rather than the Black Legion, would represent a significant diminishment of Abaddon's claim to lead all the traitor forces. This would almost certainly result in open conflict between the two, at some point. A conflict that would itself be extraordinary to consider in terms of lore implications. Abaddon against Curze is not simply a military contest, it is a philosophical one. Abaddon believes in chaos as the fundamental reality underlying all power. Curze believes in fear as the fundamental mechanism of all authority. These are not compatible worldviews, and both Primarchs are the type who need to be right. Now consider the Imperium's reaction. The return of a traitor Primarch in the current era with Robert Guillemot prosecuting the Indomitus Crusade and Lion L. Johnson active in the Dark Imperium, would be an event of the highest possible strategic priority. The Imperium has been dealing with the active Daemon Primarchs for years now. Mortarian's plague wars against Ultramar, Magnus's constant interference with the Space Wolves, and the wider psychic awakening. The return of Fulgrim as the capstone of the 10th edition narrative cycle. Each of these required significant resources and narrative attention to counter. Curze would be different from all of them in a specific way that makes him potentially more dangerous than any of the Daemon Primarchs currently active. The others fight with overt displays of chaos power. Their corruption is visible and measurable. The Imperium, for all its dysfunction, has developed over millennia the institutional knowledge to recognize and counter the specific expressions of each chaos god's power. Grandfather Nurgle's plagues, Tsienchian sorcery, Kornate berserkers, Slaneshi temptation. There are responses to all of these, imperfect and costly responses, but responses nonetheless. There is no Ordo Hereticus protocol for a Primarch who does not actually serve chaos in any conventional sense. There is no standard response to a being whose primary weapon is the rational argument that you are already doing what he does, just calling it something nicer. The Nighthaunter's particular brand of existential challenge is not something you can ward off with a purity seal or counter with a battle psyker. It works on people. It has always worked on people. Even among the loyal Space Marine chapters, descended from legions that fought against the Night Lords, there are those who have privately thought about the questions Curze raised and found them uncomfortable. And in the current galaxy, with the Imperium having spent more than a century fighting wars that have required increasingly extreme measures to win, with whole sectors having been effectively abandoned to the Rift or to alien invasion, with the machinery of imperial authority more visibly dependent on fear and suffering and controlled misery than it has been since the age of the High Lord's greatest corruption, Curze's core argument lands harder than it ever did. He was saying that the Imperium maintained itself through fear and violence dressed up in the language of duty and faith. In the 42nd millennium, watching billions of people die in wars fought by an institution that cannot afford to tell them the truth about what is happening, his argument requires very little embellishment. For Guillemot specifically, a returning Curze would be something like a mirror placed directly in his path. Guillemot is the most self-aware of the loyalist Primarchs, the one most capable of recognizing inconvenient truths and working within systems while trying to reform them. He has had, since his own return, a complicated relationship with what the Imperium has become and what he is doing to maintain it. He knows that the Indomitus Crusade is costing lives at an extraordinary rate, and that many of the decisions it requires are decisions that the idealistic Primarch who wrote the Codex Astartes would have found troubling. Curze, if he comes back with his philosophy intact and his gift for pointing at the mechanism behind the rhetoric in full working order, would not need to win a single military engagement against the Ultramarines to damage Guillemot's project. He would need only to be loudly and publicly right about a few things. He would need only to demonstrate, in the way he has always demonstrated, that the gap between what the Imperium says it is and what the Imperium actually does is wide enough to drive a Night Lord's war fleet through. This is why the Nighthaunter's return changes everything. He is not just a military threat. He is an epistemological one. He makes it harder to believe the story that the Imperium tells about itself, and in a setting where belief has genuine ontological weight, where faith in the Emperor literally empowers the Astronomicon and maintains the psychic infrastructure that holds the Imperium together, making that belief less certain has consequences that extend all the way to the foundations of reality. For the Chaos Gods themselves, and here we move into territory where speculation really earns its label, a returning Curze, who still refuses to align himself with any single god, represents a fascinating variable. The Chaos Gods are fundamentally competitive with each other, and fundamentally opportunistic in how they engage with mortal and immortal actors. A Primarch who walks independently through the galaxy, spreading terror on a civilizational scale, producing the exact kind of overwhelming existential fear that feeds chaos generally without being claimed by any specific god's portfolio, is simultaneously something each god wants and something none of them fully controls. Tzeentch would be delighted by a Primarch whose every action changes things, whose return reshuffles all the existing plans and counters the strategies of all the other powers simultaneously. Khorne would be satisfied by the violence that attends the Night Haunter wherever he goes, regardless of whether that violence is committed with any particular devotion to the Blood God. Even Nurgle, whose domain of despair overlaps with some of the emotional territory that Curze has always operated in, might find something to appreciate in a figure who spreads hopelessness on an industrial scale. Slaanesh would be interested in the extremity of sensation that attends the Night Lord's operations. None of them would fully own him. This is the interesting thing about Curze, the thing that makes him such a uniquely destabilizing force, even for chaos itself. He is not a piece on anyone's board. He is the chaos in chaos, the variable that no model fully accounts for. There is also the question of what Curze himself would want, returning to the current state of the galaxy. The vision holder who saw everything that was coming, who accepted his apparent death as vindication, who left behind a legion and a philosophy and a 10,000-year absence, would return to find that he had been more right than even he might have imagined. The Imperium he feared was fundamentally corrupt has become even more so. The civilization built on the pretense of noble purpose, maintained by fear and violence, has become, in the long years of the Long War and the Rift, and the constant emergency of the 42nd millennium, less and less able to maintain the pretense. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality has grown wider. The fear has become more visible. The violence has become harder to justify, even in its own terms. If Curze returns and finds a galaxy that has proven him right on a scale that even he did not foresee, the question becomes what he does with that vindication. He has already accepted death as its proof. What comes after vindication? What does the Night Haunter do when he is no longer arguing a case, but simply living in the consequence of having been correct? This is the most interesting narrative space the lore has to explore. Not Curze the villain, not Curze the chaos champion, not even Curze the tragedy. Curze post-vindication. The figure who was right about everything and has to decide what to do with being right. Does he try to build something with the Night Lords and the territory he carves out of the Dark Imperium? Does he simply continue proving the same point on an ever larger scale? Does he, in the unfathomable privacy of his own precognitive understanding, see something beyond the immediate satisfaction of vindication that gives him a new direction? The Night Haunter, returning to the 42nd millennium, would not be the Night Haunter arguing his case. It would be the Night Haunter past the argument, in a position where the question is no longer whether he was right, but what he does now that he was. That is a story that the Warhammer 40,000 setting has never told before. That is the story that makes his return change not just the Night Lords, but the entire philosophical landscape of the setting. The traitor Primarchs who are currently active are all engaged in versions of the same projects they began during the heresy. Mortarion is still at war with life. Magnus is still trying to prove his knowledge and power justified what he did to the Space Wolves. Angron is still trying to find enough blood to quiet the screaming in his head. Fulgrim is still the masterpiece he became at the cost of who he was. Curze would be doing something new. He would be past the heresy in a way that none of the others are. He would be in the 42nd millennium, not as a continuation of what he started 10,000 years ago, but as something that developed in the dark of a long absence, and is ready to act in ways that even his visions might not have fully mapped. He is the darkness that thinks, the void that has plans, the night that is just beginning. And if Games Workshop understands what they have in this character, if they understand that the Night Haunter is not just the most compelling traitor Primarch, but one of the most philosophically interesting figures in all of science fiction and fantasy, then his return will not be handled as a simple faction boost for the Night Lords, or as a symmetrical response to the loyalist Primarchs coming back. It will be handled as what it is, the return of the one Primarch who was never fighting to win, the one Primarch who was always fighting to be right, the one Primarch whose entire relationship with existence was built around seeing clearly in the dark and saying, calmly, what he saw. He is coming. The Night Lords feel it in the visions that flicker at the edges of their gene-gifted prescience. The Imperium can feel it in the way the dark seems heavier lately, more watched, more weighted, with specific intent. The Chaos Gods can feel it in the variable that keeps appearing in their calculations, the factor they cannot account for because it does not belong to any of them. The Night Haunter is not gone. He was never gone. He was simply waiting for the moment when the galaxy had made itself ready to understand what he had to say. That moment is now. The Great Rift is open. The Dark Imperium is waiting. The Night Lords are scattered and hungry and ready to be called home. The darkness is alive, and in it, something is smiling. Death is nothing compared to vindication. The question of what Konrad Curze would do with the Night Lords as an actual governing force is one that the setting has never had to answer because the Night Lords have never governed anything in a sustained way since Nostromo. Curze had a governing philosophy, tested on Nostromo, and applied to the worlds the Night Lords touched during the Great Crusade, and it was effective in the narrow sense of producing compliance. Whether it could produce anything else, whether a Night Lord's controlled sector of the Dark Imperium could develop into something that persisted and grew, rather than simply consuming its substrate until there was nothing left to consume, is an open and genuinely interesting question. The parallel with Nostromo is instructive. Nostromo under the Night Haunter was orderly and economically productive by the standards of what it had been before him. The mining operations continued. The patrician class was not eliminated, but it was constrained. The worst predatory behaviors were suppressed. It functioned. What it did not do was develop, because the mechanism of fear does not produce development. It produces compliance, and compliance is not the same as growth. A population that does what it is told, because it is afraid of what happens if it does not, is not a population building civilization. It is a population surviving in the space that the structure of fear has left for them, with whatever energy is left over after the cost of sustained terror has been paid. In a galaxy that needs genuine development, that needs populations capable of building the kind of economic and cultural and technological infrastructure that sustains a civilization across centuries, the Night Lord's model of governance has a ceiling that becomes visible relatively quickly. You can take a sector and hold it through fear. You can extract resources from it and use those resources to fund further operations. What you cannot do, sustainably, is build something that outlasts the fear enforcer. Because the moment the enforcer is not present, the moment the threat becomes theoretical rather than immediate, the population returns to baseline. Nostromo's lesson, the lesson that broke something in Curze when he came back to find his homeworld had reverted, plays out again. A returning Curze who understands this lesson and has had 10,000 years to think about it might have arrived at a different approach. Not a rejection of fear as a governing mechanism, because that is too fundamental to who he is and what his visions have always shown him about how people respond to things, but a more sophisticated integration of fear with something else, something that produces the kind of genuine buy-in that fear alone cannot generate. The question of what that something else might look like in the hands of a being with perfect precognition and 10 millennia of preparation time is the most interesting narrative question a returning Night Haunter opens. The philosophical implications extend beyond governance into the core of what the Chaos versus Imperium conflict is actually about. The standard framing of that conflict, the one that the setting's narrative most often uses, is a binary between the Emperor's civilizational project and Chaos's entropic destruction. Order versus disorder. Structure versus the consuming void. The Imperium, for all its horrors, represents something that at least aspires to preserve humanity across time. Chaos represents the annihilation of everything in the service of entities that feed on suffering and do not care whether their food source continues to exist or consumes itself. Curze's position in this binary has always been ambiguous in a way that makes him interesting rather than simply troubling. He is technically a traitor. He fought for the traitor cause. He has done things that put him firmly in the category of enemies of the Imperium by any reasonable accounting. But his motivation was never the destruction of humanity or the empowerment of chaos. It was, and remained throughout his existence, the correction of a misunderstanding. He wanted the Imperium to be honest about what it was. He wanted the Emperor to acknowledge the mechanism that made the project work. He wanted the argument about civilization to be conducted with the full terms on the table, rather than some of them hidden behind rhetoric, and some of them outsourced to figures like him, who could be condemned for doing openly what the institution did, quietly. A returning Curze would be neither a straightforward servant of chaos, nor a straightforward enemy of the Imperium. He would be something more uncomfortable than either of those positions. He would be the voice that refuses the binary, that insists on naming the third thing that exists between the two, that makes both sides of the conflict less comfortable in their self-understanding, simply by being present and being accurate. For the people of the galaxy, the billions of ordinary human beings who make up the substrate on which all of these cosmic dramas play out, a Night Haunter returned to the Dark Imperium would be terrifying in the most immediate possible way. His methods did not become less extreme over the course of his life. There is no reason to believe they would become less extreme in return. The people living in the isolated systems of the Dark Imperium, already struggling with the consequences of the Great Rift and the absence of effective Imperial protection, would face something worse than most external threats. Because the Night Lords do not simply conquer and move on. They establish the kind of fear that changes the atmosphere of a world permanently, that leaves people different in their bones from what they were before. And yet, the very real possibility exists that a Night Lord's controlled sector of the Dark Imperium, under Curze's direct governance rather than the unfocused predation of current warbands, might be more survivable for its population than some of the alternatives, than an isolated world with no governance fighting off chaos cults and greenskin raiders and the slow entropy of disconnection from Imperial support structures. The Night Haunter's version of order was terrible, but it was order. His version of protection was protection bought at an unbearable price, but protection nonetheless. This is the most uncomfortable implication of his return, and it is one that the setting is mature enough to present without resolving it neatly. A world that survives under the Night Lord's protection is not a world that has been saved. It is a world that has traded one kind of suffering for another kind. But a world that does not survive at all is a world where the question of which kind of suffering is more tolerable becomes academic. In the Dark Imperium, where survival itself is not guaranteed, Curze's offer, if he makes one, has a logic that is very hard to dismiss entirely. He was always most dangerous, not when he was simply violent, but when he was right. In the 42nd millennium, in the broken and frightened and desperate Dark Imperium, he will be right more often and more visibly than he ever was during his first existence. The galaxy has made itself into the argument he was always making. It has become the evidence for his thesis in ways that even he could not fully have anticipated, though perhaps his visions showed him something of the shape of it. Death is nothing compared to vindication. He said that at the end of his first chapter. He said it as the final word of an argument he had spent his life constructing. The vindication is complete. The argument is won. The 10,000 years of waiting in whatever dark he has been waiting in have produced a galaxy that proves his point so thoroughly that even pointing at it feels redundant. What comes now is something else. Something the Night Haunter has been thinking about in the long, patient dark, in whatever state he has existed in since Tsagwalsa, while the galaxy confirmed everything he always knew about itself and waited, without knowing it was waiting, for the question his return will ask. Not the question of whether he was right. That question has been answered. The question of what you do when you are right about everything, and it has not been enough. That question has never been asked by anyone, with both the wisdom to understand it and the power to act on the answer. In the whole of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, in the entire history of this universe, no one has been in the position the Night Haunter will be in when he returns. He will be. And what he decides, when he is in that position, will echo across a galaxy that is already holding its breath in the dark. If this journey into the void kept you company tonight, whether you made it through in one sitting or took it a piece at a time, it means more than you know. The Night Haunter's story is one of this setting's genuine masterworks, and it deserves to be told slowly and fully the way all the best dark things do. Drop a like if you want more deep dives like this one. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We have a lot more darkness to walk through together, and we are only getting started. Until then, sleep well, or don't. The Night Lords would find that more interesting anyway. The philosophical landscape of the 42nd millennium has been shaped by 10,000 years of the Long War in ways that create a very specific kind of receptivity to what Konrad Curze represents. The populations of the Imperium, the billions of ordinary people who live and die in the Emperor's name across 10,000 worlds, are not naive. They are not blindly faithful in the way that Imperial propaganda might prefer. They are people who have survived, generation after generation, in a universe that kills without mercy, and that offers its protection in exchange for obedience and faith and the willingness to die on command. They understand the transaction. They have always understood the transaction, even when they chose the language of faith and devotion to describe it, because that language was more bearable than the naked description of what was actually happening. Curze's return would speak directly to this understanding, not by telling people something they did not know, but by being the embodiment of the thing they had always been told not to name. He is the mechanism made visible. He is the price tag left on the merchandise. Every Imperial citizen who has ever watched a friend or family member conscripted into a war they did not choose, who has ever seen an inquisitor exercise the Emperor's justice in the specific and terrible way that justice gets exercised in the 40th and 41st millennia, who has ever felt the absolute and non-negotiable nature of the authority above them and understood that non-negotiable means exactly what it sounds like, would recognize Konrad Curze, not as an enemy, necessarily, as a familiar, as the version of something they already knew, that had the honesty to not pretend to be something else. This is not a defense of his methods. His methods are indefensible in the way that the methods of anyone who builds their entire operational framework on the deliberate infliction of terror are indefensible, regardless of the philosophical framework that surrounds them. But it is an acknowledgement of why he continues to resonate, why the Night Haunter is not simply a villain in the way that most villains are villains, but something more specific and more unsettling, something that the setting returns to again and again, because the questions he poses do not have clean answers, and the setting is honest enough to not pretend they do. His return also opens a specific and important question about the future of the Night Lords as a faction in the narrative. They have been a fringe element for too long, powerful in individual stories, and largely absent from the main narrative threads of the current setting. A returning Konrad Curze changes this immediately and permanently. You cannot have a Primarch active in the current era, and have that Primarch's Legion continue to be a fringe element. The Night Lords become a major faction the moment their Gene Father comes back, and a major faction with a Primarch whose specific abilities and whose specific philosophical challenge to the existing order make them narratively central rather than merely powerful. The Night Lords under Curze would become the faction that the other factions have to think about when they are planning anything in the Dark Imperium. Not because the Night Lords will necessarily have the largest armies or the most powerful weapons or the most divine favor, but because the Night Haunter's return changes the information environment of the galaxy in ways that nothing else can quite replicate. He knows what is coming. He knows what the other factions are planning before they execute those plans. He knows where the vulnerabilities are, and what will hurt most, and when to strike, and what will be left standing after the strike lands. He is, in any environment where information is a resource, the most dangerous possible player. And in the current state of the 42nd millennium, information about what is coming may be more valuable than any army. The setting needs this, not because it needs another villain, or another threat, or another faction capable of mass violence, of which there are already more than the narrative can comfortably contain. It needs the Night Haunter's specific function, which is the function of the character who cannot be answered by force, and cannot be dismissed by rhetoric, and cannot be incorporated into either side's narrative framework, without that framework breaking open to reveal what was inside it all along. Every story about justice needs someone who asks what justice actually is when you strip away the ceremonial aspects. Every story about civilization needs someone who asks what civilization is made of and who paid for it. Every setting that takes the question of power seriously needs a figure whose relationship with power is sufficiently honest to make everyone else's relationship with it more difficult to ignore. Konrad Curze is that figure for Warhammer 40,000. He is the most important missing element of the current setting's narrative, the character whose absence is felt in ways that his brother's absences are not, because his brother's absence could be explained as rest, or healing, or exile. His absence feels like something that cannot stay absent forever, like a question that has been put on hold but has not been answered, and will not stop being the question simply because time has passed. He is the darkness that thinks. He has been thinking for 10,000 years, and the galaxy, which has spent those 10,000 years becoming exactly what he always said it was, is finally ready to hear what the darkness has concluded. The Night Lord's particular relationship with the Chaos Gods also bears one more careful examination in the context of a potential return, because it shapes both the mechanism of return and the nature of what returns. The four ruinous powers have never been comfortable with the Night Lords as a faction. The Night Lords fight without devotion. They spread terror and despair and suffering in quantities that feed the warp's ambient power, but they do so without directing that feeding toward any specific god's portfolio in the formal way that the Word-bearers or the Thousand Sons or the World Eaters do. They are, in the language of the Chaos cults, chaos undivided, in the loosest and most uncooperative sense of the term. They acknowledge the gods exist the way you acknowledge the weather exists. It is real, and it affects things, and you navigate around it, but you do not pray to it. This has made the Night Lords simultaneously useful and irritating to the Chaos Gods across the millennia. Useful because their activities generate the kind of raw psychic material, the fear and suffering and despair, that the warp feeds on. Irritating because they cannot be reliably directed, cannot be given strategic objectives that serve any specific god's interests, cannot be incorporated into the intricate long-game planning that entities like Tzeentch engage in on timescales that make mortal history look like a brief moment. They are a force of nature from the god's perspective rather than a tool, and forces of nature are by definition not under anyone's control. A returning Curze would intensify this dynamic considerably. He would be the most significant force of nature in the galaxy, the most capable and most strategically sophisticated, and still the least incorporated into any divine agenda. The Chaos Gods would find him simultaneously extremely valuable and deeply inconvenient, which is precisely the position Curze has always occupied in relation to any large authority structure he has ever encountered. His relationship with divine power would look very much like his relationship with the Emperor's authority during the Great Crusade. He would acknowledge its reality and navigate around it without subordinating himself to it, and he would do so with the specific confidence of a being who can see all the gods' plans before they are executed and adjust accordingly. Whether the gods would attempt to forcibly claim him is an interesting question that the lore leaves genuinely open. They tried to claim him in various ways during his lifetime, and found him resistant in ways that most mortal beings are not. A post-Tsagwalsa Curze, having spent time in the warp or having somehow preserved himself through other means, would be even less susceptible to the specific techniques the gods use on beings who are not already deeply invested in their divine frameworks. He would be a stone in the machinery, something the machinery has to route around rather than process. And in routing around him, the machinery of the Chaos powers would expose exactly the vulnerabilities that Curze would need exposed in order to do whatever it is he has been planning for 10,000 years. He was always the person who made systems work against themselves by being the thing they could not accommodate, the Emperor's system, the traitor coalition, the Chaos God's eternal game. He has never been in service to any of them. He has always been the question they could not answer. He is still that question. He will always be that question. And when he comes back, the question will be louder than it has ever been, asked in a galaxy that has spent 10 millennia making itself into the most compelling possible evidence that it needs to be answered.